By the time the Beatles walked back into EMI studios in October 1965, they weren't chasing inspiration. They were outrunning exhaustion. The public saw four smiling faces conquering the world. What they didn't see was how relentless that year had been. Back-to-back tours, constant press, albums released faster than most artists could write singles. The band had barely processed their last record before they were expected to deliver another one, better, bolder, and immediately. Rubber Soul wasn't planned as a statement. It was a deadline, a Christmas release that had to be finished no matter what shape the band was in. And the shape they were in wasn't good. Sleep was inconsistent. Patience was thin. Creativity came in short, intense bursts, followed by long stretches of silence. Inside the studio, the atmosphere felt compressed. Conversations were clipped. Decisions were rushed. Songs were written and recorded at a speed that bordered on reckless. Mistakes weren't fixed because there wasn't time. If something worked once, it stayed. If it felt strange, it stayed too. This pressure cooker changed how the band operated. They stopped polishing joy and started documenting mood. Rubber Soul didn't sound darker because they planned it that way. It sounded darker because that's how the room felt. What makes this period unsettling isn't chaos. It's control. The band was functioning like a machine that refused to slow down, even as parts began to wear out. Everyone sensed it, but no one said it out loud. Complaining felt weak. Stopping felt impossible. And here's where things quietly shifted. This was the first time the studio stopped feeling like a playground and started feeling like a refuge. Touring had become overwhelming. Crowds were loud enough to erase the music itself. The studio was the only place they could hear themselves think. That isolation changed everything. Songs turned inward. Lyrics became evasive, personal, sometimes uncomfortable. Rubber Soul wasn't just being recorded, it was being extracted, and while fans would later praise the album's warmth and intimacy, the truth is colder. Rubber Soul was born from pressure, fatigue, and a growing sense that the old version of the band couldn't survive much longer. And the person who felt that shift first was John Lennon. If Rubber Soul feels more personal than anything that came before it, that shift begins with John Lennon. Not because he planned a confession, but because he stopped pretending he wasn't changing. By late 1965, Lennon was tired of being clever for the sake of it. The playful wordplay, the harmless love songs, they felt dishonest. Fame had boxed him in, and the pressure to stay likable started to feel suffocating. Inside the studio, that frustration didn't explode. It leaked. His lyrics became indirect, almost evasive. Stories with missing pieces, characters who said one thing and meant another. Norwegian Wood wasn't just unusual, it was evasive on purpose. Lennon later admitted he was writing about real experiences, but disguising them just enough to avoid consequences. The truth was there, but buried under suggestion. People around him noticed the change immediately. Lennon would arrive energized, then suddenly withdraw. Focused for hours, then distant without explanation. Some later described it as paranoia. Others hinted at altered perception. The grounded explanation is simpler and more uncomfortable. Emotional overload combined with exhaustion and creative pressure. Lennon was thinking faster than he could articulate, and the songs became the outlet. Rubber Soul was the first time he let uncertainty into the music without resolving it. No clear morals, no neat endings, just tension left hanging. That uncertainty affected the room. When Lennon brought in a song, the energy shifted. Everyone paid attention, not because he demanded it, but because the material felt raw, unfinished in a way that couldn't be polished without losing its edge. Still, Lennon wasn't trying to take control. If anything, he was letting go, and that created a vacuum. Someone had to stabilize the sessions, keep things moving, make decisions. Lennon wasn't interested in that role anymore. This is where Rubber Soul quietly becomes unbalanced. Lennon was leading emotionally, but retreating structurally. He brought the mood, not the map. And while that made the music deeper, it also made collaboration harder. There's a reason Rubber Soul feels intimate but slightly uneasy. You're listening to someone think in real time, without a filter. Lennon wasn't offering answers. He was exposing questions he hadn't figured out yet. And while he was turning inward, someone else was stepping forward to keep the machine running. Calm, organized, quietly decisive. Because if Lennon was letting go of control, Paul McCartney was about to pick it up. While John Lennon was pulling inward, Paul McCartney was doing the opposite, quietly stepping forward. Not with speeches, not with arguments, with preparation. Paul arrived at the Rubber Soul sessions, focused and unusually composed. He came in with songs nearly finished, melodies tight, harmonies mapped out in his head. In a room full of fatigue and uncertainty, that kind of clarity carried weight. Someone had to keep the sessions moving, and Paul was willing to do it. But here's where things subtly changed. McCartney didn't announce leadership. He didn't challenge Lennon directly. He simply made decisions, adjusted arrangements, reworked lyrics, suggested changes that were hard to argue against because they worked. Songs like Michelle and You Won't See Me weren't light detours. They were anchors, structured, melodic, emotionally restrained. They balanced Lennon's ambiguity with control. And that balance is why Rubber Soul holds together as an album. Still, control has a cost. Paul's growing influence wasn't resented openly, but it was felt. Sessions became more efficient and more clinical. Ideas were shaped quickly, sometimes before others had time to push back. If Lennon was exposing raw emotion, Paul was refining it into something presentable. This dynamic created tension without confrontation. Lennon didn't fight for dominance. He drifted. Paul filled the space. Neither acknowledged what was happening, but everyone sensed the shift. Rubber Soul became the first album where the band wasn't moving instinctively as four, but strategically as individuals. What makes this period unsettling is how polite it all was. No shouting, no ultimatums, just subtle redirection. Paul didn't seize control, he inherited it by default, and once that pattern started, it became hard to reverse. There's a reason Rubber Soul feels cohesive, yet restrained. You're hearing compromise layered over uncertainty. Lennon's emotional looseness filtered through McCartney's structure. Beautiful, but slightly tense. Paul later described this era as productive, and it was. But productivity isn't the same as harmony. Rubber Soul sounds like confidence because it was built by someone trying to hold everything together before it slipped. And while Lennon pulled inward and McCartney pushed forward, someone else was quietly drifting away from both of them, listening less to the band and more to something entirely different. Because Rubber Soul didn't just shift leadership, it began to separate paths. While John Lennon turned inward and Paul McCartney stepped forward, George Harrison began moving sideways, away from both of them. Not dramatically, not loudly, almost invisibly. During the Rubber Soul sessions, George spoke less than he used to. He listened more, watched longer. His role in the band hadn't disappeared, but it had narrowed. Songwriting decisions moved faster than his comfort zone, and when ideas were dismissed, they weren't argued, they were shelved. What people often miss is that Harrison wasn't disengaged, he was redirecting. Rubber Soul coincided with a growing obsession with sound itself, rather than song structure. tone, texture, mood. When he brought a sitar into the studio for Norwegian Wood, it wasn't meant as a novelty. It felt instinctive, almost necessary. To the others, it was interesting. To George, it was grounding. That difference mattered. While Lennon wrestled with emotion and McCartney focused on control, Harrison was searching for meaning. Not fame, not dominance, meaning. And the studio wasn't always receptive to that kind of shift. Some later described his behavior as detached or distant. A few even suggested he seemed elsewhere during sessions. The grounded explanation is far less mystical and far more human. Harrison felt creatively constrained in a band that was accelerating past him. Rubber Soul marked the first time he seemed aware of his own isolation. His contributions were fewer, but his curiosity was expanding rapidly. He listened to unfamiliar records, studied unfamiliar instruments, sat quietly while decisions were made without him. That silence is important. It wasn't passive. It was observational. Harrison was learning who he was inside a group that no longer felt balanced, and once that awareness settles in, it doesn't go away. The irony is that Harrison's influence on Rubber Soul is subtle but permanent. The album's introspective tone owes a lot to his presence even when he wasn't speaking. His interest in non-Western sounds cracked open a door the band would later walk through completely. But during these sessions, that door wasn't fully welcomed. It hovered at the edges, interesting but inconvenient. And that quiet exclusion planted something deeper than resentment. It planted independence. Because once Harrison realized he could explore ideas outside the band's center of gravity, he stopped waiting for permission. And that shift, barely audible on Rubber Soul, would later become impossible to ignore. And while George drifted into his own orbit, the studio itself began to feel different, heavier, stranger. As if the room was absorbing everything no one was saying. By the middle of the Rubber Soul sessions, something subtle changed inside EMI Studios, not anything you could point to. No single moment, just a growing sense that the room felt heavier the longer the nights went on. Sessions stretched late, often past the point where fatigue blurs into detachment. The band wasn't just recording anymore, they were sealed off from the outside world. No crowds, no screaming, just the same walls, the same lights, the same looping tape reels. That isolation played tricks. Normal sounds began to feel loaded. The hum of machines lingered longer than expected. Voices echoed strangely in the control room. Silence didn't feel empty, it felt occupied. Years later, fans would describe this period as haunted. Stories surfaced about unexplained noises, odd moods, and a strange tension that seemed to hang in the air. Some even claimed the music itself carried something unnatural, as if the studio had imprinted on the recordings. Here's the grounded reality. EMI Studios was a technical labyrinth. Miles of wiring, aging equipment, tape machines running hot for hours, microphones sensitive enough to pick up air movement, footsteps, distant vibrations from other rooms. Add exhaustion, caffeine, and emotional pressure, and the brain does the rest. Patterns appear. Sounds gain meaning. Coincidences feel intentional, but the band leaned into it anyway. Instead of correcting imperfections, they explored them. Reversed tape effects, unusual mic placement, compression pushed harder than industry norms. Sounds weren't cleaned up, they were preserved. That decision is why Rubber Soul feels intimate but slightly unsettling. You're not just hearing songs, you're hearing the room. Breath between lines, fingers sliding on strings, tiny imperfections that make the music feel alive, almost watchful. This is where paranormal rumors blur into psychology. The studio wasn't haunted. It was overloaded with emotion, fatigue, and unspoken tension, and the music absorbed all of it. Still, the band felt it. Conversations slowed. Jokes landed less often. People left the room without explanation. No one said the word strange, but everyone thought it. The studio had stopped feeling like a workplace and started feeling like a container, holding thoughts that never made it into conversation. And when a space absorbs enough unspoken emotion, it begins to feel like it has a presence of its own. Not supernatural, psychological. That presence shaped how Rubber Soul sounded, not through fear, but through attention. Every note mattered more, every silence felt intentional. And as the nights went on, the pressure didn't ease. It multiplied, because the deadline was still coming, and the madness wasn't done scaling up yet. By the final stretch of the Rubber Soul sessions, the pressure stopped feeling abstract. It became measurable. You could count it, track it, hear it in the way decisions were made faster and arguments were avoided entirely. The album wasn't falling apart, but it was being held together by momentum alone. And momentum doesn't ask whether people are ready. It just keeps going. Here's what that period actually looked like when you strip away the mythology. In just 4 weeks, the band wrote and recorded nearly an entire album. Not demos, finished tracks. At a time when most artists spent months refining a single song. Sessions regularly ran 12 to 14 hours, often stretching past midnight. There were days with 0 breaks between touring obligations and studio work. No reset, no distance. They recorded 2 to 3 songs per session, sometimes finalizing arrangements on the spot. Lyrics were rewritten minutes before vocals were recorded. If a take felt good enough, it became permanent. Rubber Soul used more studio techniques than any previous Beatles album, including heavier compression, altered mic placement, and experimental tape handling, methods that were still considered risky in 1965. And perhaps the most telling number of all, 0 full days off during the core recording window. This wasn't inspiration striking at lightning speed, it was endurance. The band didn't have time to reflect on what they were making. They moved instinctively, reacting to pressure rather than planning around it. That urgency gave Rubber Soul its immediacy, but it also erased the safety net. What makes these numbers unsettling isn't that they're impressive, it's that they were unsustainable. Every decision had weight, because there was no time to revisit it. Every compromise stayed embedded in the final record. This is where rumors of madness creep in. Fans point to the speed and say it must have been chaotic. The truth is more controlled and more dangerous. The band was operating at full efficiency while emotionally depleted. That's when mistakes don't look like mistakes. They look like choices. And once the album began taking shape, something even stranger happened. Instead of relief, there was tension, because everyone could feel it working, and no one knew why it felt so costly. Rubber Soul was becoming something new, something deeper, but it was also quietly teaching the band a lesson they'd never forget. They could survive under this kind of pressure, and that realization would change how far they were willing to push themselves next. By the time the final tracks of Rubber Soul were taking shape, something unexpected happened. The album was working, not just technically, but emotionally, and instead of easing the tension, that success made everything feel more fragile. Inside the studio, there was no celebration, no release. Just a quiet awareness that they had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Rubber Soul sounded different because it was different, more inward, less performative. And that raised an uncomfortable question no one wanted to ask out loud. If this worked, what came next? The band had discovered they could create depth under pressure. That discovery is intoxicating and dangerous. It reframed exhaustion as a tool rather than a warning, silence as productivity, distance as focus. This is where the fractures became permanent, not explosive, structural. Lennon's emotional openness no longer required group consensus. McCartney's organizational control no longer needed permission. Harrison's inward drift no longer felt temporary. Each of them learned they could move forward independently while still producing something powerful together. From the outside, Rubber Soul looks like unity. From the inside, it felt like parallel paths converging just long enough to finish a job. That shift changed how they listened to each other. Suggestions became selective. Engagement became strategic. Nobody was fighting, but nobody was fully sinking either. The unsettling part is how functional it all was. The album didn't sound fractured, it sounded focused, and that made the underlying distance harder to detect. Success disguised the cost. Rubber Soul taught the band that emotional strain didn't break creativity, it sharpened it. That lesson would echo through everything that followed: late nights, isolated writing, pushing boundaries without checking in. There's a reason people describe this era as the beginning of the end and the beginning of greatness. Both are true. The same conditions that deepened the music quietly eroded the glue holding the band together. No one walked out. No one made threats. They just adjusted their expectations of each other. That adjustment mattered more than any argument ever could, because once expectations change, relationships follow. Rubber Soul didn't end the Beatles, but it normalized distance. It made separation feel productive, necessary even, and when distance stops feeling dangerous, it stops being temporary. The album closed without closure, no resolution, just a sense of forward motion without a map. And that's the feeling Rubber Soul leaves behind. Not nostalgia, not joy, momentum. And momentum, once it takes hold, doesn't ask where it's going next. When Rubber Soul was finally finished, no one in the band talked about it like a breakthrough. There was no victory lap, no sense of arrival. If anything, the mood was restrained, almost cautious. The album didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a door that had been opened without knowing what was on the other side. What Rubber Soul truly unlocked wasn't a new sound. It was permission. Permission to abandon certainty. Permission to let songs remain unresolved. Permission to prioritize internal truth over public expectation. That shift altered how the Beatles approached everything afterward. Lyrics no longer needed to explain themselves. Arrangements didn't need to chase immediacy. Silence, space, and ambiguity became tools rather than risks. From the outside, this looked like artistic maturity. From the inside, it felt like stepping onto unstable ground. The band had learned that discomfort could produce results, and once that lesson is internalized, comfort starts to feel unnecessary, even suspicious. Rubber Soul also redefined authorship. Songs no longer felt equally owned. They felt guided, shaped, claimed. Lennon's introspection became more pronounced. McCartney's precision became more dominant. Harrison's curiosity became more detached from group approval. None of this caused immediate conflict. That's what makes it so easy to overlook. The album succeeded. Critics praised it. Fans embraced the change. The band was rewarded for tension, not punished for it. That reward system mattered. It quietly reinforced a dangerous equation: emotional strain plus isolation equals progress. And once that equation works, it becomes repeatable. Rubber Soul normalized a new creative logic, one where personal distance didn't threaten the work, it strengthened it. One where cohesion was optional as long as the output felt honest. This is why the album feels like a hinge point rather than a destination. Everything before it sounds like momentum, building. Everything after it sounds like acceleration. The band didn't realize they were laying the groundwork for deeper separation because nothing had gone wrong yet. Success blurred the warning signs. Rubber Soul proved they could survive fragmentation. It didn't show them how to live with it. That distinction would matter later. Long after the sessions ended, the album continued to feel different, not just to listeners, but to the people who made it. It marked the moment they stopped asking whether something should be done and started asking whether it felt right. And once that question becomes the standard, there's no clear way back. Rubber Soul didn't just change what the Beatles made, it changed how far they were willing to go. Rubber Soul ends quietly. No grand finale, no clear resolution, just a feeling that something has shifted and isn't going back to where it started. That's what makes it linger. For listeners, the album feels intimate, warm, even comforting. But intimacy can be misleading. Sometimes it's closeness, sometimes it's exposure. Rubber Soul exposes a band learning, in real time, that they don't need unity to create something powerful. That realization is both liberating and corrosive. It frees artists from limitations, but it also removes the incentive to protect the group itself. Rubber Soul doesn't document a breakup. It documents a redefinition. After this album, the Beatles would never again operate as four people chasing the same instinct. They would collaborate, overlap, and occasionally align, but always from separate internal worlds. The shared center was gone, replaced by intersecting paths. Nothing about that was obvious in 1965. There were no headlines, no public fractures. Just an album that sounded deeper than anything they'd done before. And depth has a way of disguising damage. This is why Rubber Soul feels haunted to some listeners. Not because of ghosts or hidden messages, but because it captures a moment of transformation without offering guidance. You can hear the band stepping into something unknown, unsure whether it will save them or cost them everything. Every eerie rumor, every strange interpretation, every theory about the sessions traces back to that uncertainty. The album feels alive because the people making it were in motion, emotionally, creatively, psychologically. Nothing was settled, nothing was resolved. Rubber Soul doesn't tell you what to think. It invites you into a space where comfort and tension coexist, where growth feels necessary but vaguely dangerous, where silence matters as much as sound. And that's why the question it leaves behind still matters. When you listen closely, you're not just hearing an album. You're hearing a decision being made without anyone fully realizing it yet. A decision to move forward even if it means drifting apart. So, when Rubber Soul plays, what are you really responding to? Is it the sound of a band discovering its true voice? Or the moment they learned they didn't need each other the way they once did? That answer has always been binary, and Rubber Soul never tells you which one is right.